This is Ben Cohen interviewing Marcie Greenberg on November 8th, 1995, in an office at the Jewish Federation building. Marcie, I'm going to be talking with you today to get an oral history for the Archives Committee of the School of Social Work at USC. I've known you for a long time, Marcie, and I'm very happy to be the one who is going to be talking with you. So, have you ever been interviewed this way in any kind of attempt to get a history?
No, not to get a history. No. I've been interviewed based on some of the things I've done, but never to get a history.
Not to get straight. Okay. Now, how did you get into the almost full-time job of being a volunteer
in the Jewish community? Or in the other community?
And don't limit yourself to the Jewish community. It's not just for the Jewish community, it's for the entire community. I knew you in the Jewish community, but I know that you've been involved in the general community as well. So how did you first get involved in all of this, Marcie?
Well, I was very young, very impressionable, and I ran for the school board in Beverly Hills. And at that time, Paul Zifrin was organizing grassroots groups. So we became basically a campaign based on people who joined the Beverly Hills Democratic Club, which was formed at our house. And we ran the first organized kind of campaign. We had postcards, we had teas, we didn't have wine in those days. And I lost the campaign, but that was my first political activity. And as a result of that, you get to know people in politics, you work in various jobs in politics, and ultimately I was appointed to the State Social Welfare Board. You'd be interested to know, I took the place of a guy named Jerry Sampson. I don't know if you know him. He then became the director of the State Social Welfare Board, really a department. And he had taken Carmen Warshaw's position. So it's a long line of people that you know who had a position, and I was appointed by Governor Brown, the one who was called the real Governor Brown,
the original
Governor Brown. And I had a very interesting experience with that whole field. I was appointed to the State Social Welfare Board, although I had only an academic and clinical background in the field. I had a dual major in sociology and psychology from UCLA. And I had an MA from Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I had worked at Rice Davis Child Guidance Clinic. And it was at that experience, from that experience, that I realized that the Beverly Hills school system was really dedicated to people who were very smart, had good support at home. And I had this patient who felt so inadequate, and she performed at a higher level than the standard for her grade. So I was incensed. I was young enough to be incensed. And that's how I happened to run for the school board. When you do that, then you get known to people. And people in my campaign basically wanted to involve me in the Jewish community. And I didn't have a lot of time then, but my first contact with the Jewish community was on the Board of Jewish Family Service at the time that Frieda Moore was the director. Long time ago. Long history there. You know, what was your original question? How to get involved?
Yeah,
that's basically how I got involved.
Okay, I'm going to stop right here. Okay, Marcie. Okay, Marcie, can you give me an idea of some of the involvements you've had in all the years that you've been involved in this kind of work?
Well, I spent several years on the State Social Welfare Board. I chaired a statewide study on abused and neglected children. I was on the Department of Education's committee for preschool compensatory education. And that's basically government appointments. I also served on LA County's Protective Services Committee, and I served on an analysis of the state welfare program, which was done, I think by system. I think it's in that resume. I forget the name of the company that did it, but it was basically a study done by the state. And I served on various county committees related mostly to social welfare and mostly to programs for the poor. In the Jewish community, I was from Jewish Family Service. I was president, and because they continue your membership on their executive committee, I've been on their executive committee ever since. And I was appointed by Jewish Family Service to a United Way position, and ultimately served on the corporate board of United Way and in Region 4 on their board, and was chairman of their budget committee. And what happens in all these organizations, if you're there long enough, you serve on most of the committees. In the Federation, I've been on the board of the Federation for many, many years, as you know. I have been an officer. I've been on the executive committee for a long time. I just recently was chair of the personnel committee. I'm presently co-chair of the resettlement committee. I was chair of the planning and allocations committee. I chaired several studies. I think you worked with me, or I worked with you on the Jewish poor.
Right.
And then we did a population study, and we did a study on the aged, as I recall. And I was co-chair with Dick Gunther on informal education on the Barbie Weinberg Futures Study. So I've done a lot of that. Was chair of the research committee for a while.
What else were you
I should add that the committee that I chaired that caused the most uproar basically was the review of the Jewish Community Bulletin, which resulted in its demise after many years of having been studied and perpetuated. And sometimes I feel that was one of the highlights, because we now have a Jewish community newspaper that people read and value.
Yes.
I don't think I've done anything else that upset so many people.
But the outcome was...
The outcome was good, yeah. In the non-Jewish community, I served at UCLA on the School of Medicine on their recombinant DNA committee and on their Human Subjects Protection Committee. And I belong to a group called American Women for International Understanding. We are invited to many countries in which the United States has a hard time establishing relationships. And the women, all those countries, most foreign countries, have women's committees. And they basically invite us to come. And we meet with people who are in the same fields that we are in. We're briefed before we go by the United States Information Service. And it's been a very exciting, interesting activity. Been to Egypt and Israel and Iran, Greece and Turkey and Russia and China. We were invited to Russia by Valentina Tereshkova, so that was a very interesting experience. We also served on an AFL-CIO committee for health plan alternatives. That was also another arena and very interesting one, which led me to be a speaker at the County Medical Association, where they practically booed me off the podium because I really thought people had a right to health care. And we were basically describing peer review, which was new at that time, and they didn't much like it. So that was another really interesting experience.
I had a lot of them.
I have a lot of experiences, and all of them have been wonderful. I mean, they are think another really interesting one is every year the Army War College invites people from all over the United States, a small number, to come and participate in their studies, their seminar. They choose a topic that their lieutenant colonels study. The men at the Army War College are people who have the potential to be generals. They're all lieutenant colonels. And then they decide that they will invite lay people from all over the country to come for 2 weeks and see whether the view that the lieutenant colonels have of these problems mesh basically with the view that people from outside of the military have. And for me it was very, very interesting because I was about to go to Iran, and at that time there was a lot of talk about the Army's involvement with Israel, and particularly there was some discussion about a base for the United States Navy in Haifa. And I was the only Jew on our 16-person group. And it was very interesting because the Army's view of its relationship, in the United States' relationship to Israel, was basically that it had to stand by Israel because of its honor, because the United States' honor, it had promised it would do that. But its real interest was in oil. And they happened that year to be studying the impact of oil on our economy and on our political world. So we had a really interesting discussion. It was interesting for me for 2 reasons. First, I was about to go to Iran, so I was talking with the Iranian students here at UCLA. And it was my understanding from them that the Shah was shaky. And in the discussion in our seminar, they had just had an Army intelligence man return from Iran, and it was his position that the Shah had an army totally devoted to him. So I asked the question with why did he think that was true, and that I had heard that because he was so far ahead of his population in terms of the privileges he was giving to women and trying to bring that country into the modern world, that he really was in a shaky position. The interesting part for me is they treated me like a woman, like, what do you know? And so, to a degree, a year later when the Shah fell, I almost wanted to write back and say, see, I told you so. But again, you have a lot of, almost all the things I have done in the government and outside of the Federation, I have been the only woman. I was the only woman on the State Social Welfare Board, the only woman with the AFL-CIO group, and various other places. As a woman, living through this women's rights growth and development in terms of equality, it's been an interesting many, many years.
No, I want to ask you, Marcie, this isn't one of the questions that I said I would, but it just occurred to me that I ought to ask you this, and we can get into some discussion about it, I think. And that is the role of the professional as relating to lay people. And just some of your thoughts about that, kind of relationship that you have developed with the professionals, that kind of thing. Okay? Talk about that.
I remember Jerry Bubas had, I think, a couple of programs I spoke at those times. Yeah, I think the relationship of a lay person to a staff person varies depending on their personalities. As a lay person, you know that you're a temporary figure. A staff person basically has to spend some time getting used to your style, so that there's a period when you start in a relationship in which you need to set some ground rules. And neither of us, when you first begin, I'm talking about if I'm chairing a committee, have an idea of what the other's expectation is. There are some lay people who don't want to do anything. They want to arrive at a meeting, have an agenda presented to them, and basically just call out the names of the people who are going to make a presentation. They have no role in setting the agenda, and as far as their staff person is concerned, he or she is in charge and basically makes all the contacts with all of the people. That really isn't my style, as you know. And I think my style basically came out of the State Social Welfare Board because we basically were a hands-on group of people. We were a court of last resort. We did grants. We lived through the welfare rights movement, in which social workers really led that, and it was a fascinating experience, but you got the feeling that you were responsible for what was going to happen. I don't know that all lay people feel that they're responsible for what's going to happen. I think a staff person is a very difficult position because that staff person has to relate to the supervisor, the director of the agency, or the director of the entire federation, or United Way, or School of Medicine, or whoever. So they have two taskmasters. They want to help you do a good job. They want to please you, but nonetheless, they're accountable for their job to a person who is in a staff position. So if you are a layperson, and I know it's more true of men than women, and you expect to have your word be the law, that what you want to do is the thing that's going to happen, you're in for a rude awakening. Staff controls lay people, I think, in two ways. One, they withhold information. They basically don't give you the facts of, what the budget is, or what the players are in this particular program or problem. They basically use you sometimes, that's not true of all staff, but they basically use you as a puppet. You basically run the meeting, you make the arguments for a budget committee, or you make the arguments at a big meeting, but you aren't part of their team. Their team is all staff. The best relationships, in my experience, have been joint relationships with staff and lay people, because I think that starting out a project and putting your heads together and deciding where you want to go and how you can get there and facing up to the problems that I described in terms of having to be accountable to your chief if you're the staff person, and you as the lay person having to carry the ball. A lay person can say things that a staff person cannot say. A lay person can go outside of channels. If I want to talk to the president of the federation or the executive vice president, I don't have to go through channels. I just pick up the telephone, I make an appointment. But usually my staff person has got to go through channels. That slows up the project. We have to talk about my doing that. In other words, I'm not going to act without informing my staff person of what I'm up to. I can take a position at a meeting which is contrary to what the executive vice president or the president of the federation believes, wants to happen, and it doesn't reflect on my layperson, on my staff person. My staff person can't take that position. My staff person's got to go along with what the director says. So that in order for all that play to occur, you have to have an honest relationship. It takes a while to establish that. When I get a chairmanship, and if it's a staff person who doesn't know me from some other arena, they don't know who I am, they don't know what my style is, they don't know whether I'm a nice person or I'm a not nice person, they don't know if I'm demanding or reasonable, they just don't know. They don't know what my background is. Nobody ever asks me what my background is. It's really interesting. And so the relationship, if I had to describe a good staff lay relationship, it starts with the understanding that you need to be honest with each other, and you have to have confidence in one another's ability to use good judgment, particularly in talking about what you're up to. One of the things that Howard Cherish did with me, which I thought was a genius kind of thing to do with a staff person, with a lay person. I was chair of the budget committee at that time, and he was the director of planning. To preserve his time, because again, he doesn't know me. I basically don't call you a lot, right? Your experience with me, I don't call you a lot. We set up a regular meeting. It was his idea to set up a regular meeting once a week, and each of us would have an agenda. And during that period of time, we would get our business out of the way. Then he is free for the rest of the week to run his shop. He doesn't have me calling him 5 times a week. One of the problems that I see in lots of the lay staff relationships is that the layperson is on the back of the staff person so much of the time and asking for so many things that the staff person basically doesn't do or has to spend a lot of time getting the information and can't do his job. So there has to be a lot of consideration and understanding of the staff person's needs. There isn't a lot of understanding. And I have heard stories of, people don't behave well, which surprises me. I've not heard stories of staff people who don't behave well. I've only heard stories of lay people who don't behave well. And they're all men, Ben. So how do you basically train your layperson? If I had to make a suggestion to staff, I would certainly have an orientation meeting with my chairperson. I might have lunch with them. I might describe at that time how I work, who I have to please, what my constraints are, what my time is, who I have at my disposal, what things my secretary can handle, what things I should know, so that the groundwork is laid for how you relate and work together, because the best programs come out of, I think, a joint working together. I think it's called, we're a team.
Right.
Is that enough?
No, that's fine. Excellent, as a matter of fact, Marcie. I really appreciated your contribution to that. I think it is a contribution. Which did you find most gratifying personally, and what obstacles did you encounter? What successes, non-successes?
I think I made some notes on that one. I have a lot of them, Ben. You want to hear the first one? Okay. Did you know Frida Moore?
Oh, sure.
Well, Frida's a very strong person.
Yes, you are.
I was very young. I'm not even going to tell you how young. I was very young. I became president of the agency. And we had several fights. And the 2 big fights we had were about, I wanted students in the agency. I wanted them to come and intern in the agency. Frida did not want them in the agency. I wanted them there for 2 reasons. First, they're spies. The truth is, they know what's going on. And secondly, they bring to an agency what is new in the field. I mean, they're on a cutting edge of new techniques. They would be the first to tell you we do family counseling at a time when all family service agencies were doing one-to-one counseling. So, and I believe that strongly. And that's because I came out of that Harvard education thing where they like that process. And we fought about that over and over. And I won. I loved it. I won. And the other thing was we thought about starting a fundraising group because the handwriting was already on the wall. What happened in Jewish Family Service, we're talking now about the 60s, was that if we wanted to get a kid a bar mitzvah suit, we had to somehow get a hold of some, friendly housewife group that were a club that met on Fridays or something, and see if they would pony up $5 a piece and we could buy a suit. That's no way to run a business. So we started out having a very small fundraising. It was another fight because in those days the agencies were deficit funded. The theory being that the Big Daddy Federation would supply them with all their needs. But it didn't work that way. So those were the 2 big issues, and I won them both. I don't remember the ones I lost.
I want you to know that I did a history of Jewish family service as my dissertation.
I didn't know that.
My doctorate program. And Frida was still alive, and I interviewed her.
You did?
I did. she surprised me. I can't remember the name of the woman. The first ever director, professional director of Jewish Family Service, was a friend of hers, and she surprised me once when I came over with a tape recorder to talk with her, and she had the first president there. And that was quite an experience.
Who was that? You don't remember?
I can't remember her name. I'll look it up in my
Yeah, that's
dissertation.
interesting. That was interesting. Well, Frida was a very interesting. She's a very interesting staff person. When I talk about withholding information and manipulating your lay people,
right.
she was a master at that. I had one other fight with her. I used to say to her, because she wasn't really, she was getting on in years, that she needed to develop somebody as an assistant who could replace her if anything happened to her. I had a conversation with her brother George, if you remember George, the psychiatrist. He said she'll never let you do it. And she had at that time a woman whose name now escapes me, who was her best social worker. You probably remember her if you think of it. And at that time we had just begun to develop programs for the aging. And I didn't know whether it would be a better organizational structure to have it as one large committee within Family Service, or it should be a freestanding committee or a freestanding almost agency because there was money for it. Frida wouldn't hear of it being freestanding. She didn't want this woman to have this much power. So it was, and I was a neophyte. I hadn't had any experience with any staff person before. It was, when you say, what do I remember? Boy, I remember. It was a bath by fire.
Yeah, right.
But it was good. I mean, she was a good fighter.
Yeah, she was.
She was a very good fighter. And I grew a lot. I learned a lot. And it was nice.
Good.
You asked me what other things I did I like. Well, I made presentations to the legislature to get protective services developed at the county level. And as a matter of fact, we lost the first two bills. But the next year, with a different governor, Reagan was the next governor, the bill passed, the very same bill. And one of the legislators who I had convinced that we really needed to protect abused and neglected kids carried the ball for me. And remember Mary Ripley by any chance? Mary Ripley was with the Child Welfare League, and she's a Republican. She was invited to the signing of that bill. So she suggested it would really be a nice gesture to invite me, since I had been the person who had headed the study and I had done all this arguing and, it's the wrong word, all of this lobbying for the bill. And Reagan sent back the message that no damn Democrat's going to get any credit for this. So she brought me back a pen that was used to sign the bill. I felt very good about that. I really did. And the other things that I felt good about was our study on the Jewish poor, because until then the Jewish community didn't accept that there were poor people, if you remember. And also, while all of this activity is going on, there was this women's movement beginning to grow. And one of the things the campaign had me doing all the time was talking about budgeting to the women who were in the women's committees and in various places. And I used to tell them that budgeting was nothing to be afraid of. If you notice, in those days there were very few women on that committee. There were certainly, I was, I think, the first woman chair of that committee. And that budgeting was what they did every day with their household stuff, that it is no big mystery. And I spent most of my time convincing them that they should comfortable with numbers, they should be on those committees, they should volunteer to be on those committees, they should lobby to be on those committees. And ultimately they did, so I felt that was a very good thing.
Okay.
I could go on, but it's enough already.
You mentioned some obstacles that you had, like being a Democrat.
Right.
In the wrong place. But what were some of the obstacles that you found in trying to achieve things?
Well, there's several. In terms of programs, trying to meet needs, the obstacle is always money, basically money. And also the people who have a vested interest in what is presently going on and are willing to add on to what's going on, but not willing to give up what is going on. I served on the governor's, I think it was called Blue Ribbon Committee for the Family, which ended up recommending today's present divorce law. And a judge and I were really the only ones who were against that law. It was a no-fault divorce, but it divided everything evenly, gave no regard for what any woman's ability was to live at the same level she lived when she was married. One of the things that was at that time, I don't know really how to phrase it, it is the mood of the time. It is basically what is in the atmosphere of the general public's belief. And the problem with that divorce law was at that time, because I think the present divorce law is very bad for women. At that time, there was this myth that women were equivalent to men, and therefore you didn't have to protect them by giving them more money or giving them anything special, that everything should be divided in half. And this judge from Sacramento said, that's ridiculous. But no one would listen because there was this groundswell of the equality of the sexes. And in addition to that, there was a mood prevailing among men that they were abused in the divorce realm, that they gave the money, they didn't get to see the kids, and that the women were exploiting them. And that was a very popular theme at that time, and that law reflects it. And it hasn't changed. And, one of the reasons the welfare rolls went up so precipitously after that law was passed was because you had people who had no training, who had no previous work experience, suddenly are thrown into the work world, and they can't support themselves, and the men didn't pay child support. So how do you describe an obstacle of the mood, political mood of the moment? I don't really know, but it is very effective. It is a big determinant. Other obstacles basically have to do, I think, with not knowing how to carry out what you want to do. A classic example is I had some friends who wanted some advice about how you got the school system to change. There was some program they wanted to do. So who were they picketing? They weren't picketing the Los Angeles school system. They were picketing the State Board of Education. They had the wrong target. One of the obstacles to success is not knowing the target. And not knowing your political system, even in this building. If you don't know the political system in this building, you're also not going to get things done. So an obstacle to getting anything done is being too innocent.
Were you looking? Is it
It's
still running?
moving.
Okay. Are you watching? Because I
Yeah, you
can't
got
see
quite
it.
a bit, yeah. Am I telling you more than you want to know?
No. This is fine. Fine. Talk a little bit about ways in which programs might be developed. What's your view about measures that you as a volunteer and layperson can undertake to affect programs and policies that would be more or less effective if pursued proper volunteers, legislators, and so on. The idea that some kind of measures that
What you can do?
that can affect programs.
You're talking about developing programs?
And
Killing programs?
You know,
Well, when you lobby, I mean, we all know how
talking with the
you...
right people.
If you lobby politically, you have to deal with people who give money to a particular candidate. Hopefully, it is the candidate who has some power. One of the things the Jewish community here in Los Angeles does not do well is that. I'm told, as you remember, my son-in-law was in Congress. The federations do not know how to lobby. Wiesenthal knows how to lobby. We had a lobbyist in the Council of Jewish Federations, had a lobbyist in Washington, effective on some issues and not effective on a lot of other ones. You really, I don't see this community ever coming up with the dollars to hire a lobbyist in Sacramento or in Washington. I think that they rely on CGF to do that. But the way you get legislation passed is by lobbying, and the way you lobby successfully is to have the backing of contributors. I mean, everybody knows that it's called special interest lobbying. In my experience in nonprofits, both the United Way and the Federation, there's 100 ways to get a program. If you remember, we had this experience, Ben. Before I agreed to chair the study on the Jewish poor, I got Ted Cantor to agree that he would fund the programs that we recommended before we did the study, not after we did the study. When I was personnel chair, I said I wouldn't take the chair unless we got some money for staff development, because that's the money that got cut out in previous budgets. And they finally promised me, we negotiated, I started out with $25,000, they came back, finally we settled on 10. But I wasn't going to take that chairmanship unless there was money to do this program. So the method basically is get your money up front. Get your promise and commitment up front. Otherwise, you're wasting your time, and we have a lot of studies to show that. Other ways, of course, within nonprofits is basically to have good allies, and those people are those people who want to give money or can get money, or they're people who have positions in your organization. If you really did your job right, you would lobby the entire executive committee. It's exhausting, but that's what you would do. And in order to do it well, you, one, have to get the facts first. You have to know what you're doing. You can't just give a bunch of generalities and say, we should do this, it's a nice thing to do, people need it, and we know they need it. You have to know how many people need it. You have to know what it costs. You have to know who is going to do it. You really have to be a person that they have some confidence in. And then you have to risk. You still have something. You have to basically make your story and be prepared to lose. I always feel that if you're going to do something new, you're going to lose a couple of times. And you have to convince your staff person to take the risk, because staff people, if they lose, they feel that they lose prestige. One of the problems I have with all nonprofits is that there's a lack of risk-taking. A man in his business always takes risks, but in nonprofits, the staff people don't take risks. And a risk is not something you do aggressively. It's something you do by promoting something in a good fashion that is new to people. They don't understand it. You have to talk. You have to present it and fail. You have to present it again and fail. Ultimately, it passes. You may not get credit for it. Somebody else will get the credit. But what you've done in failing is educate. So that's how you get it done.
How many other specific questions that I
Let me give you a good example of what I'm talking about. Because I feel like I'm in the midst of it, but I'm going to be off the scene soon. In the Resettlement Committee and the Acculturation Committee, because of the lack of money, we have cut back to the bone the entire acculturation program. While that's going on, so the Federation doesn't have to give a large contribution to the program, we have this new, very general goal of Jewish identity and Jewish continuity. We have here a mass of people, Iranians and Russian South Africans, large numbers. We're not talking a small group. We're talking a large group of people. We have their names, we have their addresses, we have the number of kids they have, we know what their skills are. If we want them to be Jews, put our money there. Why should we cast a broad net to try and make an unknown group of people into people who identify as Jews? Now, I said that to several people in the campaign, that they basically have, Russians been here 10, 15 years, they're living very well. Cultivate them. It goes on deaf ears, but I've said it often enough so that it got raised at yesterday's budget hearing. I guarantee you within 3 years there's going to be a focus on these group of people, and people will finally realize that it's short-sighted to not do the acculturation, to not make Jews of Russians who are very aggressive, who are very good at feathering their own nests, who want to be, successful, who want to make money, and eventually they'll want the prestige. You've got to nurture them. So that's what I'm talking about.
I would certainly agree with that.
Well, but somebody's got to sell it. Somebody's got to say it to you. Somebody's got to say it to the chairman of the campaign. I'm not in campaign, but Ron Cabrams is. So,
He's with you.
oh yeah, because it gives people a different view of what they're doing. Jewish continuity to me is a very vague topic, and so is Jewish identity vague. But scholarships for schools, camping, community events, they're not vague. And that's how it happens. Trips to Israel, some people believe were. Now I think your tape is almost done. You probably have more than you need.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to add to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, one last thing.
Go ahead, and I can put another tick on that. That's not a problem. I'll turn it around.
I think the nature of who you serve when you're a health and welfare agency is changing. I think that there is a reluctance to accept the change. And we saw it when we began to use government money to do programming, because the uproar was we're not serving Jews. And the truth is you can't serve Jews these days unless you can serve others as well. The government has provided support for the elderly and the poor, has not provided anything for the middle class, lower middle class, middle class. Gradually, Jewish Family Services is a good example. Their service has begun to be directed more to the middle class and less to the poor. First of all, you can't do much for the poor with the amount of money we have to begin with. And with the middle class, you can do groups, you can do vocational training, you can do a lot of things and get a fee. There is a what's the program? IBM and various other organizations, work-family programs are being developed in the private sector. I think the most honest givers of service are Jewish agencies and other nonprofits as well. Pretty soon, the profit world is going to wake up and say, Jesus, we can provide those services.
Sounds as if it stopped.
No, it's still going. It's almost done.
Sorry.
And that if you want to exist with the lack of funds that's going on in the United Way and in the UJA, then you've got to find a way to keep your programs alive and still provide service. And I think that's a coming trend, but there's a lot of heels that are dug in to not really consider it. And it's time for Jewish Family and Children's Services to begin to develop networks which will serve insurance companies, which will serve hospitals, which will serve big businesses that offer these programs to their employees. That's, I think, all I have to say.
Okay, well, Marcie, thank you very much. This has been Marcie, I think you have a PS.
Yes, I was an example of an agency that could basically plug into services which will pay for themselves, and which basically I think are the future of the centers, who, if they would further develop their after-school care for children and their nursery school programs and their adult daycare programs, companies, big companies will pay for those services. Parents will pay for those services. Children who have the burden of trying to find something for their elderly parents to do and a safe place for them to be will buy those services, but they have to give up the sporting activities that are classic to them. They have to give up some swimming programs and the things that in the past were culturally their raison d'etre, especially in California, where anybody who wants to play handball, soccer, go to the beach, go skiing, does not go with the centers. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. The future does not lie with those old programs of sporting activities, or even health clubs, frankly.
Okay, thanks again,
Okay.
Marcie.
Is that what